Take a look at all the instruments that this lady has.
De mi tierra bella, de mi tierra santa, oigo ese grito de los tambores y los timbales al cumbanchar. Y ese pregón que canta un hermano que de su tierra vive lejano y que recuerdo le hace llorar. Una canción que vive entonando de su dolor, de su propio llanto y se le escucha penar. La tierra te duele, la tierra te da en medio del alma cuando tú no estás. La tierra te empuja de raíz y cal, la tierra suspira si no te ve más. La tierra donde naciste no la puedes olvidar porque tiene tus raíces y lo que dejas atrás. La tierra te duele, la tierra te da en medio del alma cuando tú no estás. Siguen los pregones, la melancolía y cada noche junto a la luna sigue el guajiro entonando el sol. Y cada calle que va a mi pueblo tiene un quejido, tiene un lamento, tiene nostalgia como su voz. Esa canción que sigue entonando corre la sangre y sigue llegando con más fuerza el corazón. La tierra te duele, la tierra te da en medio del alma cuando tú no estás. La tierra te empuja de raíz y cal, la tierra suspira si no te ve más.
That, my friends, was called a salsa, which means sauce, hot sauce in Spanish. It came about when a guy by the name of Ignacio Pinedo composed a song called Échale Salsita, which means put a little hot sauce on it. And that was a way of telling the musicians to increase the tempo of the music to get the dancers to get all turned on. I'm going to tell you more about it next week, but for now, I can just say that was Gloria Estefan, a Cuban American, singing a song that was composed by a Colombian. And I'll tell you more next week. So welcome, fellow Rotarians and guests, to my penultimate meeting, 5304. Our June 23rd birthday greeting goes out to our immediate past president who joined Rotary in 2002, Karen Sinanu Towery, looking all Hollywoody. She personified true grace and agility as we entered the pandemic last March 2020. Happy birthday, Karen. Looking good. Okay, next we have a red badger by the name of Megan Fluke. Megan Fluke is the executive director of the Green Foothills, and she's got an inspirational thought for us. Megan, you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you, Fernando. What have we learned from sheltering in place for the past year? Will we go back to the pre-pandemic daily life we knew? Or has our experience changed our perspective on what life should look like? It can't be sugar-coated. The pandemic has been catastrophic and traumatic. You likely know someone who struggled having kids at home 24/7, or lost their job, or even worse, lost their life. Some folks were in a position to adapt easily, while others barely held on day to day. Yet, almost everyone experienced one thing during the pandemic: more time at home. Pre-pandemic, we were all way too busy moving from place to place, too busy to take care of our bodies, our families, and for the multiple social and environmental crises of our time. And then came circumstances that forced us to look inward, bringing about the opportunity for radically positive change. In an instant, systemic racism and the environment around us were at the forefront of discussions. Our slower lives, now forced into a new yet familiar space, revealed what can and should be. People experienced more family time and sleep, started gardening and cooking, and enjoyed cleaner air, birds singing, and parks close to home. Years before the pandemic, experts told us that one of the best ways to change behaviors to benefit our well-being and the environment was to have more time. It's safe to say that they were right. As we define our post-pandemic life, you might want to ask yourself, what is most important to me, and how do I want to live my life? For me, I'm going to keep gardening and keep up the fight for racial justice. I refuse to go back to the unprioritized, frazzled life I knew pre-pandemic, and I will never take a hug for granted again. May we protect our time as our lives depend on it, because they do, as if our lives depend on it, because they do. A weekly 8-hour commute should not be normal for anyone. Let's be patient and kind to one another and hard on the systems not serving us. May we keep digging our hands in the soil, protect our family time, and be thoughtful with our words. May we be true to ourselves and lead the lives we always dreamed for the benefit of our bodies, our neighbors, and the environment. The planet and all living things that depend on it will thank us. Thank you.
Sounds like the Green Foothills has a good leader right there. Thank you for that very inspirational thought, Megan. Next, we've got Michelle Acosta, our resident songstress who joined Rotary in 2018. She sponsored our newest member, Mike Hubert, who's CEO of his own marketing group. So Mike, in just 3 minutes, please tell us all about yourself.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Hubert. 37 years old. I live in Los Altos. I've been fortunate enough to be spending about the past 3 years of my life working with a lot of individuals in San Jose, and luckily also with some Rotarians. I've been working closely with Steve Borkenhagen and Christine Davis and John Ball on the Urban Confluence Silicon Valley project. This has been a very successful effort that I know the whole team has put together, and obviously we had the unanimous City Council approval. So excited to continue to work on that and go into that second phase. Also been very grateful to work with Joshua Burrows and Eric Hayden with Urban Catalyst. We've been able to have a very successful fundraise with our Fund 1, and we're able to close at 130 million to help deploy funds into San Jose to continue to develop. We're looking into going into Fund 2, and we're definitely hitting the ground running. Also fortunate enough to work with Michelle Costa and Acosta Sheet Metal. Very, very excited to work with them. I spend time working with Aaron Salazar at Local Color. So as you can see, I do spend a lot of time in San Jose. My background is software. So I come from, the software startup scene in San Francisco. Before I moved down here to the South Bay, I was very active in the startup scene. And before that, I used to work in the action sports industry. So I used to work for a skateboard magazine, or the world's #1 skateboard magazine, which is called Thrasher. That was sort of my right brain career. That was more on the video production, graphic design, events. And then when I shifted into software, it became left. So the Hubert Group is it is basically me. It is that hybrid marketing. It's thinking creative, but also being very analytical simultaneously. The only thing I've been doing longer than marketing is skateboarding, which is one of my passions. I've been doing that for about 26 years now. I think I've been marketing for only about 18. So you can see that that's something that I'm very passionate about. I'm originally from Reno, Nevada. That's where the majority of my family lives. I own a house out there in the Reno Tahoe area, so you can usually catch me out there, usually in Tahoe or maybe at a casino playing blackjack. A couple of other things that I enjoy doing is riding motorcycles. I own 2 Harley Davidsons, and I'm kind of a bit of a gearhead. I'm also working on a 1970 Chevy Monte Carlo, so I'm working on building that right now as well. When I do have time, I just like to build engines, whether they are for vehicles and or digital marketing engines. And I believe that's me in a nutshell.
Wow. Quite a bit of varied background. Thanks. We're looking forward to meeting you in person, Michael.
Awesome. Thank you.
You'll be pleased to know that our next speaker, Dr. Karen Philbrick, who joined us, Rotary in 2009, is co-chair of the membership committee. She's riding on a motorcycle with her dad on their way home to Ukiah, but they stopped off at a Starbucks to briefly describe her concept behind the Circle of Recruitment Excellence. Dr. Philbrick, are you with us?
I am with you, and thank you so much for that kind introduction, Fernando. My fellow Rotarians and friends, it's such a pleasure to see many of you today and to talk about the Recruitment Circle of Excellence award that was established under President Fernando's tenure. We have dug into the data and we have some real stars in our club. And we're looking forward to honoring many of you, those who have recruited 5 and above, 10 and above, 20 and above, and even 50 and above. But we decided to pivot, and rather than do this virtually today, we're going to wait until we can be in person and celebrate this together as a Rotary family. And we'll be doing that sometime in President-elect Steve's year. However, we had one standout this year, a 2021 recruitment superstar that we needed to honor. It's my privilege to announce this winner. He is my sponsor, and it is Mr. Rod Dierdon. He has been a Rotarian for almost 50 years. He lives and breathes Rotary and shares the gift with so many. In fact, this year we were able to bring in 29 new members, and he was responsible for a significant portion of that success. Rod, thank you for representing our club so well, and thank you for giving this gift to so many. Back to you, President Fernando.
I love those braids there, Dr. Philbrick. Love those braids. So right well.
Thank you.
Right well.
Thank you.
Right safely, right. Rod Dierdon Sr., he joined us in May 5th. That's the Cinco de Mayo to some of you, in 1971, as of our annual gala this May 5th at the San Jose History Park. As Karen said, he celebrated 50 years with our club. He retired as executive director of the Moneta Transportation Institute at San Jose State University, our alma mater. He was he's been a club director, a foundation trustee, club president in 2009, 2010. And over those 50 years, like Karen said, he estimates he's recruited about 150 new members, 150. As my mentor this year, it's my honor to have Rod be the first recipient of the Circle of Recruitment Excellence Award as a public acknowledgement for his heartfelt belief in the values of Rotary. It's a gift he generously gives and has shared so successfully to so many. So thank you, Rod. The award today, unfortunately, is virtual. Sorry. When we get in-person ceremonies next year under Steve Borkenhagen, we're going to give you a certificate and a special pin to you, and other Rotarians will be recognized in 5 different levels based on the number of new members introduced into Rotary, and we'll talk about that more next year. Emeritus Rotarians, those who have brought in 13 or more new members, will have their names engraved on a plaque, perpetual plaque, to be displayed at the Gordon House. You know, this public acknowledgement of successful recruiting is our hope that it will be an incentive and an encouragement for all of us Rotarians to share the gift of Rotary with others. So thank you, Rod, and God bless you. Next, we've got President-elect.
Thank you, boss.
Steve. You bet. Next, we've got our public, excuse me, the President-elect Steve Borkenhagen joined us in 1992 when he gave us heart and soul confession a couple of weeks ago about his background. So welcome, Steve Borkenhagen. Please tell us the planning that you're doing that'll take place for our in-person return to the Summit Center.
Thank you, Fernando. And I would like to share screen if I may. So I'm going to attempt to do that. Am I sharing, Fernando?
Yes. Yes, you are.
Wonderful. Thank you. First, I would like to welcome Mike Hubert into the club. I've been working with Mike for a few years. He's been instrumental to our success so far in our project. So Mike, welcome. And you know, you can lean on me and the rest of us anytime you need to. So please do. So we're going to be moving back into the Summit Center on July 14th, assuming that the city is ready for us to do that. If they're not, I am fully committed, along with our Phoenix committee, which is our reentry committee, to meet somewhere, even if it's temporary. So we will be back face to face on July 14th. We expect to find out today whether the city is ready for us, and we are working on lots of technical details as we move forward. We will continue to Zoom. That's something that will be a permanent addition to our program. You'll be able to log into Zoom wherever you are. There have been significant investments in the Summit Center since we stopped meeting due to COVID. The city has spent about $150,000. We now have 2 screens and a number of other amenities, and we've also spent about $30,000 on new cameras and other items. A special thank you to Carl Silker, Mike Danberger, and John During. They've been working tirelessly for the better part of the last year to get the Summit Center in shape. I think we've had lots of AV problems for the last 30 years, or maybe for the last 100 years, that needed to be fixed, and they've done a stellar job of that. So when we come back together, I think you'll all see that we have a room that's much better for us and for other groups that go into the room. Mike and John and Carl need help. If any of you have AV aptitude and you'd be willing to help them as backups or on an ongoing basis, please let Leslie know, and she will hook you up with that group. Forgive me, I think I'm going the wrong way. Maybe not. I just want to warn you, food and labor costs are going up. We were not really paying a market rate for food and beverage with the Fairmont for years. Our prices were going to go up regardless. So please be prepared for that. If you would go to the chat box now, and if you can express your preferences, whether you want hot lunch, salads, soup and salad, sandwiches, status quo from what we've done for the last 30 years, whatever you prefer, please go to the chat box and insert your preferences so that we can know what members think as we move forward. That is my report, President Fernando. And if anybody is curious about issues of us getting back in, please feel free to pick up the phone and give me a call. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. It's exciting, and let's hope that you get your wish of getting back in person. That was something I had hoped would happen, but it wasn't to be. So we've got our next big project voting results. They're in. According to our inspectors of elections, Jaime Chavez, and past presidents Karen Sinunu Towery and Kay Walker, there was 1 vote against the overwhelming majority of 207 who voted in favor of our club collaborating with the county for remodeling the homeless healthcare clinic, to which our club contributed $500,000. The Next Big Project Committee Chair, Vince Sinceri, says that they will keep us informed regarding progress on this project. Pretty exciting stuff, I think. In other announcements, the Rotary staff is now in office full-time now, Monday through Thursday, 7:30 to 4. 7:30 to 4, and then on Fridays, 7 o'clock to 1 p.m. 7 to 1 p.m. on Fridays. Dues invoices for the new Rotary year have gone out, and if you have not received yours yet, give us a call. Contact the Rotary office and let them know. By the way, our friend Rose Simmons, who joined us in 2014, was a healthcare administrator. She had a brief scare. Her blood pressure evidently spiked and blew through a thin capillary, resulting in a small bleed in her cerebellum. But she says she's okay and at home, and cautions all of us to keep an eye on our blood pressure. She suggests at 130/80 and says the number of the bottom of the should be not more than 80. and I wish her a speedy recovery. Send her a note, tell her that you hope she gets well fast. As reminded by our new Rotarian, Alfreda Egan, on June 17, 2021, President Biden signed a bill making June 19th a national holiday. That's the day in 1865 when freedom came to 250,000 slaves that were living in Texas. And that was after federal troops landed in Galveston on June 19th of that year, 2.5 years after slavery was abolished by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863. However, emancipation didn't happen overnight for everyone. In some cases, slave owners withheld that information from the slaves until after the harvest season. Now, June 19th, excuse me, called Juneteenth, is a national holiday to commemorate what many have called America's second day of independence. We'll get a lot of work to do. In view of our growing concern over the environment and the melting of our polar regions, you may want to remember that in 1961, the Antarctic Treaty System came into force to regulate international relations with respect to Antarctica, the land and ice shelves on Earth's southernmost continent. The treaty includes, among others, the following rules. Research is to be used for peaceful purposes only. Military activities such as weapons testing is prohibited. There'll be a free exchange of information, personnel. The Antarctic Treaty does not recognize, dispute, or establish territorial sovereignty claims, and it prohibits nuclear explosions or disposal of radioactive wastes. The main objective of the Antarctic Treaty System is to ensure, in the interests of all mankind, that Antarctica shall continue forever to be used for peaceful purposes, shall not become the scene or object of international discord. Visiting Antarctica is a privilege and a responsibility at the same time. The Antarctic Treaty includes a protocol on environmental protection, which designates the continent as a nature reserve, and there are rules all visitors must follow. Anyone can have access to any part of the continent of Antarctica as long as it's for research and or peaceful purposes. But the Antarctic ecosystem is very fragile, and too many tourists will disrupt its delicate balance, and it can take many years to recover, if at all. Tourists, along with research scientists, may unknowingly bring seeds and spores of plants from other areas onto the Antarctic continent, and there's the threat of pollution, such as oil spills from cruise ships that are more frequently visiting that location, and other methods of transport, such as airplanes that land constantly. And they already have had a spill there in 2007. My two sons visited Antarctic. They went from Ushuaia on a Japanese tourist ship about in 2005, I think. And the one thing they recall telling me was that they had seen a lot of nature films about the Antarctic, and not one of them mentioned the stench coming from the guano that these penguins leave behind. That was the one thing that impressed them the most. Next, we've got retired judge, Honorable Arthur Weisbrot. He joined Rotary in 2005. He's on the program committee, and apparently he's a friend and colleague of our next program speaker, and he is going to introduce him now. Judge Weisbrot, are you ready?
I'm ready, Fernando. Thank you very much, President. It's a great honor to introduce Federal Judge Paul Grewal. Paul is the Chief Legal Officer of Coinbase, where more than 56 million people in over 100 countries buy, sell, store, use, and earn cryptocurrency. Paul is responsible for Coinbase's legal compliance, global intelligence, and risk and policy groups. Before joining Coinbase in August 2020, Paul was vice president and deputy general counsel at Facebook. Paul previously served as a United States magistrate judge for the Northern District of California, where we became friends. Paul was appointed by Chief Justice Roberts to the Magistrate Judge Education Committee of the Federal Judicial Center. Before that, he was a partner at the law firm of Howery LLP, where his practice focused on intellectual property litigation. Paul received his JD from the University of Chicago Law School and his SB in Civil and Environmental Engineering from MIT. Paul is an expert on both social media and cryptocurrencies, and we're very pleased to have him here. And I turn this over to Paul.
Thank you very much, the entire Rotary Club, for this kind invitation and opportunity to speak to you all today. I also have to just also extend my appreciation and thanks for that kind introduction to Arthur. Judge Weisbrot left out of his very warm and too generous welcome an important detail of our time together serving in the federal courthouse in San Jose. Judge Weisbrot was literally my downstairs neighbor. His courtroom and chambers occupied the space immediately below mine on the 4th floor as he sat on the 3rd floor. And even though he used to turn the temperature down in our part of the building to near Arctic levels on a regular basis, I really miss our time together day in and day out and relish the friendship that we've shared ever since.
Thank you, Paul.
Of course. Let me begin by asking, can you all see on the screen, a gentleman who looks about 240 years old?
No,
No.
just you. We
Just
see you.
you.
Okay.
We only see you.
Well, I don't quite look that old, I hope.
No, you don't.
There we go.
Okay, terrific. Well, if I've learned anything from my legal career, it's that the law is far too interesting to stay in one place for too long. And so as Arthur mentioned, in 2016, I stepped off the bench in San Jose and I took my talents, as the kids like to say, to the technology industry, which had grown up all around us and with which I had had almost no direct experience. Arthur also mentioned that I now serve as the chief legal officer at Coinbase, which means that I spend my days in the world of cryptocurrency. But for today, I want to actually focus on the 4 years I spent prior to my joining Coinbase when I worked at Facebook, spending days, nights, and all hours in between running the company's global litigation and regulatory affairs. It was certainly a unique time and a unique vantage point for me on all that social media has done for, and unfortunately to, our society. And what I want to focus on, especially today, is the particular nature of the deep unease that many of us feel about social media, myself included, and why I feel that most of the answers that have been offered to us for this unease by the poets, the priests, the politicians, all too often miss the mark badly. So let me begin with what I see as the 3 core elements of this unease that we are all feeling as we sit here today in the year 2021. There are undoubtedly other elements that contribute to this unease about social media, but in my mind, these are the most significant. Element number 1, social media is undoubtedly impacting our political health. Now, the founding fathers knew way back when that most previous democracies had been unstable and short-lived, and they were worried about this, right? But at the same time, they were innately, intuitively excellent psychologists, students of human nature. And to address their fears and concerns, they strove to create institutions and procedures that would work with human nature to resist the forces that had torn apart so many other attempts at self-governance. Now, I have up on the screen a picture of James Madison, who happens to be one of my heroes among the founding fathers. In the Federalist number 10, Madison wrote something very interesting about his fear of the power of faction, which is something I think plagues our politics today. And what he meant by faction, he meant strong partisanship. He meant group interests that, as he put it, inflamed men with mutual animosity and made them forget about the common good. It was Madison's insight that and hope really that the vastness of the United States, our great geography, our great space, would offer ultimate protection against the ravages of factionalism, because of course it would be very hard, if not impossible, for any one person or even idea to spread outrage across an entire continent. And he presumed that if faction were to take root at the hand of divisive leaders in one particular part of the country, it would nevertheless remain largely contained because it would be unable to spread across the entire country and spark a general flame. But Madison didn't simply rely upon geography alone. Of course, he and others urged that we include in our Constitution mechanisms to slow things down, to let passions cool, and encourage all of us to reflect a little bit more, deliberate a little bit more, and act a little bit less. Now, this design proved durable for well over 200 years. But I don't think Madison could have understood what might happen to the American democratic experiment if one day, early in the 21st century, there might appear a technology that over the course of, 10 years, give or take, would change several fundamental parameters and institutions of social and political life. I don't think Madison or any of the other founding fathers could have imagined that such a technology would massively increase the amount of mutual animosity, as Madison put it, and most importantly, the speed with which outrage might spread. That, I think, is perhaps the most important source of this unease that we are now feeling as we think about the future and our place in that future when social media dominates it so extensively. Source of unease number 2, as I see it, it's this. It's that social media is impacting not just our political health, of course, but also our personal health. Now, social media, I think we've all experienced this, has a certain reinforcing nature to it, which makes it unique. And the reason is that by using it, by sharing pictures, by reacting to others' posts, by communicating with people we know or don't know, we often activate a part of our brainstem, a part of our brain center that actually releases dopamine. This is documented, it's established. There's no controversy about this. Dopamine is a feel-good chemical. It is linked to activities which give us pleasure, things like eating a lovely meal, interacting with friends, sex, basic human instincts that are grounded in neurochemistry. These platforms that have grown up all around us can feel addictive, in large part because of this association and ability to trigger this release of dopamine. And of course, the follow-on effects are just as significant. The anxiety, the depression, even the physical ailments that follow from overuse of social media. Now, it's not surprising that to boost self-esteem and to create a sense of social belonging on social media, people post content with the hope of receiving positive feedback. But if you couple that content with the structure of a reward at some point in the future, what you get is a recipe for constant engagement. And that constant engagement also, in my view, contributes to a lot of the anxiety that we're feeling and has to be at the root of any solution that we're looking to craft to relieve ourselves of this burden. Now, the third source of this unease that I think we are all feeling day in and day out is this simple truth. It is the fact that the institutions responsible for much of social media operate at a scale unseen in human history. And I have a number of facts which I can offer to prove this point in ways I think that are very easily understood by each and every one of us. Think about it this way. I think about it this way in large part because of my own experience operating in public institutions like the courts. Facebook and Google in one single day make more decisions about what content stays up on their platform and what content comes down than the entire United States justice system makes in an entire year. In fact, they make more decisions about that subject than the justice systems of the entire free world make in an entire year. This is an extraordinary experiment we are all participating in. In a single quarter, for example, Facebook removes something like 2 or 2.5 billion fake accounts. They also remove nearly 2 billion pieces of content as spam. There are appeals filed in more than 20 million of these decisions just with respect to spam alone. And what all this averages out to is something like several 100,000 appeals being filed on a single social media platform in a single day. Now, in that same quarter that I was just referencing, Facebook receives nearly 25 million requests for appeals. And even though we don't yet have perfect information as to how many additional pieces of content it downranks or inhibits in terms of distribution, separate and apart from any decision to take content down entirely, these numbers have to cause reflection. Now, I'm not an alarmist. I'm also very proud of the work I did for nearly 4 years, helping to steer Facebook to a certain direction. I'm also very proud of the industry as a whole that I participated in. But I also believe in intellectual honesty and integrity. I think part of that honesty and integrity is that these numbers suggest we are operating in a very different environment than any of us ever imagined, or that our brains and our social and political institutions ever could have imagined. Now, to begin to think about what we can do about all of this unease and how we move past just a general anxiety to address some of these concerns so that we can be free to focus on all of the positive that has come from the development of these technologies, which I fully embrace. I think it's very important to understand a little bit of history and a little bit about how we got here. And as you'll see up on the screen, I just want to call out again the fact that we now have CEOs making more judicial decisions in a single day than the Chief Justice and each of his counterparts all over the world. Well, let's talk a little bit about that history I mentioned just now. Now, at its inception, at the very beginning of social media, things felt very different than they do today. And I think we can all appreciate that from our own personal experience. If you're talking about Friendster and MySpace and Facebook, which all appeared for the very first time sometime between 2002 and 2004, they were all about offering tools to help people connect with their friends. They encouraged people to post about their lives, albeit very curated, highly stylized images from their lives. But at the same time, they didn't really offer any meaningful way to spark outrage. Now, this all began to change with a series of small steps. They were all designed to improve the user experience. I've seen no evidence, and I don't believe there's any proof of a grand conspiracy at work here. But collectively, each of these individual decisions altered the way that news and anger spread through our society. And so I think it's very important to understand that evolution. Now, if you fast forward from 2004 to 2006, Twitter arrived. And its primary innovation was the timeline. You all will recognize that in a social media app today, you typically see posts that appear either chronologically or ordered according to some other fashion. That was an innovation that came from Twitter, which ordered this stream of 140 character updates on people's phones in an entirely new way that allowed people to consume that information in a new way. An unending stream of content that could often feel like you were drinking from a fire hose. Well, in that same year, in 2006, Facebook launched its own version of that timeline, what it calls the news feed. And 3 years later, in 2009, it added the like button, which for the first time did something very important. It created a very public metric for measuring how popular anyone's content was. And then it added yet another important transformation technologically. Algorithms, which could determine which posts a user might see based entirely on predicted engagement with that post or with that content, which is a fancy word for describing the likelihood that an individual confronted or presented with a particular post would do something with it, comment, like, share, and so forth. And it was in this environment that we began to see misinformation flourish, because an individual's single post was given the same look and feel as a post from a reputable institution, whether it's the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or any other institution. Now, there were other changes that followed soon thereafter. In 2009, Twitter also added the retweet button, which changed something very fundamental about the way that we interact with social media. Because until then, if you wanted to share content, a user had to copy and paste older tweets into a status update, which created a small barrier, a tiny obstacle, a bit of friction that required a few seconds of thought and attention. Well, with
Hey,
the
Paul,
retweet
real
button-
quick. Paul, sorry to interrupt, but I think something's rubbing up against your microphone, maybe on your
Oh.
computer. There's just a lot of rustling. Thank you.
Sorry, I apologize for that. Thank you for letting me know. So what this retweet button and reshare button, as Facebook called it shortly thereafter, basically did was to allow a single click to spread someone else's content to people in your own network and to claim some part of the social credit for the effect of that content. And this changed the mass psychology, I think, in a very, very profound way that we are still grappling with even today. Now, if you fast forward just a few years after that, what happened? Well, we started to see state actors come to understand and appreciate how these tools could be used to spread information, both positively and negatively. And we also began to see non-state actors, such as the Internet Research Agency in Russia, begin to take advantage of this and use these tools for nefarious purposes. Now, I think it's very important as we begin to think about what solutions there might be to these problems to appreciate this, that the internet does not bear, in my view, sole responsibility for the pitch of political anger that we are all experiencing today. The media, to be clear, has been a source of that division going all the way back to James Madison's time. And if you talk to political scientists from across the spectrum, they all generally agree that today's outrage is really rooted first and foremost in the cable television of the 1990s and the talk radio of the 1980s, as much as the internet of today. But nevertheless, I think it's very important for those of us who have played some part in the development of the internet, however small, and mine was extremely small, to understand that there is a role to play in this current climate that the internet and the technologies that we interact with must accept. So let me turn to what we can do about this, and then I very much look forward to the conversation with all of you about some of these topics. Well, some people think that human rights law might be the answer, and to be sure, the United Nations and other international legal institutions have published a number of very important studies and reports urging that social media adopt international human rights standards as a touchstone for deciding what content should be allowed on the platform and who should be allowed to participate on their platforms. And many of the social media companies have, at least on the surface, embraced this idea. Twitter has said that its rules would be rooted in human rights law. Facebook has also stated that its decisions, as well as the decisions of its recently announced and implemented oversight board, would also be rooted in human rights standards. But the reality is that as these companies continue to manage these very difficult questions, especially those surrounding hate speech, these decisions are being made largely without reference or reliance upon human rights norms as they've been established. And it's also very uncertain and unclear to me anyway, how private companies, particularly those operating in societies like ours here in the United States that place such a premium on freedom of speech, can really rely upon and use these human rights legal norms effectively. So I think that there are certain practical limitations that come from that model. What's another idea that people have come up with to address the concerns that I've raised and that we're all feeling in our daily lives? Well, one very popular norm today is break these companies up. There is no shortage of support legally among regulators and politically for antitrust actions that are aimed at breaking these companies into smaller components or pieces, certainly as it applies to Facebook and Google and even others. But I think the question for us all to ask of our politicians and our leaders is whether or not anti-tech antitrust is the right tool for this particular problem. Does this actually address the concerns that are motivating so much of the anxiety that we're feeling? And I would suggest the answer to that question is no. And there are good faith arguments to be had on both sides of that topic. But I do just point out that as historic as this push to break up big tech companies can feel today, those of us who have worked in the antitrust law for some period of time know that there is a long history of antitrust action going back to the days of Standard Oil and the days of the Bell system. And if you go back to each of those cases, whether it was the attempts to break up Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller's trusts, whether it was the attempt to break up the Bell system, IBM, or more recently, Microsoft, these investigations, these prosecutions, these litigations can take decades. The Bell case took nearly a decade. The same was true for the lawsuits against IBM and Microsoft. For all of the effort and resources put into that action, ultimately remained intact, albeit with a number of conduct restrictions. So I do think that history is important to understand here. And if our concerns are privacy, if our concerns are the ability to have access to platforms to engage in free speech, if our concerns are protecting democracy, I'm not so sure that antitrust action, breaking these platforms up, is necessarily the right solution. So let me just conclude by offering a thought or two on one other solution that's been suggested, which is self-regulation. Why not simply set standards for these companies and then have them essentially regulate themselves? Well, I do think there is a role for self-regulation that can be very useful in dealing with the problems that we've all confronted with social media in particular. But I think that setting standards for transparency, for example, setting standards for due process, insisting that these companies be consistent in applying whatever rules they choose to decide, only takes us so far. Because the fact of the matter is that while self-regulation might have worked 5 or certainly 10 or 15 years ago, we find ourselves in 2021 at a point of significant mistrust and distrust in these institutions, either in their goodwill in policing themselves, or perhaps more disturbing, their ability ultimately to police themselves. So I think self-regulation only takes us a certain distance. What will work, in my view? It's nothing exciting. It's not as headline grabbing as breaking a company up or calling for restrictions on speech that would run afoul of our First Amendment. I think what ultimately has to happen in order for us to make progress on these issues is to change our public fascination with performance. Because at the end of the day, engagement is ultimately driven by a desire for self-affirmation and reaffirmation by others. And I think that performative nature of social media lies at the root of all of these problems in a way that's much more profound than any of the other issues that have been flagged. I also think that we need to insist upon transparency on who is posting what content. While anonymous speech has a long and proud tradition in our culture and in our law, anonymity, I think, has been a significant contribution to a lot of the mistrust and unease that we've all been feeling about the things that we see in our social media feeds. The final solution I might offer is this. I think it's very, very important that we educate our children and educate ourselves about how to consume this content and consume this information in a much more responsible way. The fact of the matter is that while it's tempting, and some have called for the abolition of these technologies, the reality is that will not happen. And so in the meantime, our best chance for success, I think, lies in a combination of appropriate regulation, but also self-regulation on the part of individuals such as you and me. Now with that, I will pause. Thank you again for the opportunity, for the chance to speak to you all, and invite whatever questions we have time for.
Thank you very much, Paul. This is a question on everybody's mind. Are you paid in dollars or cryptocurrency or both?
I am paid in United States dollars, Arthur, although like a number of crypto firms, Coinbase does offer our employees the opportunity to be paid in Bitcoin. And I have chosen to stick with good old American dollars for now.
Okay. So how I understood your point about anonymous posts, and I agree with it. How would the companies enforce that? Is that practical, that with the number of posts that people are putting up from foreign countries, from individuals all over the world, is that realistic that the industry itself could do that?
I do think that there are solutions to this that can work. If you think about it this way, Arthur, in many of the financial sectors that, for example, we are much more familiar with: banking, now crypto assets, financial services and investments. There are requirements that you validate your identity before you can open an account. And these companies, Coinbase included, operate at a significant scale, millions and millions of people every day, in some cases, hundreds of millions of people. So I do think there are ways for us to police identification and ensure that we understand who is operating on what account in a way that's much more robust, certainly, than what we have today.
Thank you. Former President Trump has been permanently barred from using Twitter and is barred by Facebook for at least 2 years. Do you agree with those actions? And do we as a country run the risk that such actions in the future will be politically motivated?
I think it's striking that we find ourselves in a place where the decision of a private company to allow or not allow a particular individual, even if it happens to be the president of the United States, could cause such consternation and angst. I mean, I think that speaks to how predominant and prevalent many of these technologies have become. I wasn't in that room when that decision was made, so and at the same time, I have a lot of confidence that the people who were in that room took this very seriously. I think the most important thing for us to understand ultimately is what were the standards that were applied, and how are these standards going to be applied to others who engage in similar conduct going forward? Because I think more than anything else, consistency is critical here. I think American people will accept any decision or outcome if they believe that the rules are being applied in an equal and fair way.
And the rules will apply to foreign leaders as well.
Of course, absolutely.
Now, despite Trump's Facebook and Instagram ban, his PAC is raising money through Facebook ads. Does that contravene the ban, or is that otherwise a problem?
I don't know the specifics of the scope of the prohibition. My understanding is that it was individual to the former president. And so, I think that your question, though, raises an important related topic, which is that decisions about speech, by definition, or in almost every case I can think of, have winners and losers. It's a zero-sum game, and there are also ancillary effects that go beyond just any one person. And so I think it's important that as companies are making these decisions about what activities to allow banned individuals to participate in, not that they think about the speech rights, for example, of others who may appreciate the president and follow his politics and who are not subject to that ban, even as he is prohibited from engaging on Facebook.
Is it or should it be the responsibility of the government or a private platform like Google, Facebook, or Twitter to control information and its deliberate mishandling? That question comes from our president, Fernando Zazueta.
Well, Mr. President, I would say this. I think that every American individual and every American company has a responsibility for protecting the health of democracy. And so while I do think that there is a lot that the government can, and to its credit has done, to promote protecting users against misinformation by providing immunities for companies to share intelligence, for example, with one another. Fundamentally, the companies themselves have a responsibility to protect the franchise and protect the society in which they've been allowed to flourish.
Do you think Facebook wants the power to decide what posts and what people to ban, or would Facebook prefer that the government take over that role?
Well, I don't think the government can take over that role because, again, we have a First Amendment in this country that is fairly unique among democracies. I don't think that the company as a whole at Facebook has any particular desire to get into that business, because the fact of the matter is that when you start making decisions about content, you're making choices not only about whether something stays up or down, but what errors you are comfortable with as these decisions get made at a scale of hundreds of thousands of pieces of content every day.
At a social media company like Facebook or Twitter, should the company refuse to print matters which it deems to be false? And who exactly should decide whether a particular posting is true or false? For example, that taking the COVID vaccine reduces a woman's chance of becoming pregnant. There are a lot of posts on that, but not much evidence, and it scares people.
Yeah, I think the companies have evolved considerably in how they think about misinformation, particularly as it applies to public health. You've seen a much more active response from Facebook, Twitter, Google, and the rest when it comes to COVID misinformation than you've ever seen in the past, even as compared to political misinformation. I think the danger in imposing a standard that all information on a platform must be true is that you very quickly get into very gray areas that you know well as a former judge.
Right.
Very difficult to tease out. Again, especially when you operate at a scale of hundreds of thousands or even millions of decisions every day or every week.
Please comment on the growing concern that cryptocurrency allows people to do criminal acts and to hide monetary transactions to avoid regulations like income tax. John McAfee case as one point.
I love this question because I think cryptocurrency is the solution to these types of ransomware and other criminal acts. It's not part of the problem. And the reason I say that, Arthur, is that if you look at the Colonial Pipeline case, the recent incident that happened on the East Coast, that ransomware was largely traced by the FBI, who did a fantastic job, by the way, because the information about those transactions are available on a public ledger, the so-called blockchain, that all crypto assets are based on. So if you talk to law enforcement, and I hope this group has a chance to do this at some point, they will tell you that tracing money with the crypto is a heck of a lot easier than tracing bags of cash that are dropped on street corners.
Let's talk about the business model. Tech companies like Facebook make money by constant surveillance of our online behavior, running all the data through enormously complex algorithms, and then selling that information about us to their advertisers. They feed us cocktails of likable posts full of family members and cute animals to make the sites as attractive and addictive as possible. And that's their highly successful business model. Now, many people criticize that business model. Are there any realistic alternatives?
Yeah, there are a number of alternatives. First and foremost, companies can, and many choose to offer subscription services or subscription pricing to allow people to engage in this type of communication with one another. The American public has that choice with respect to a number of social media sites. Now, the fact is that advertising has proven to be far more effective in large part because people generally like free. And as much as we all, I think, take our privacy seriously and speak very eloquently when asked about our privacy, our financial decisions, our personal actions suggest that we are ultimately very comfortable with a certain trade-off between privacy and ease and convenience and price. I don't think that's unlimited. That's why I do think appropriate rules should be put in place. But I think we have to recognize that whether it's television in the 1950s or the internet in 2021, advertising has been a godsend in providing access to technology to millions of people who would not otherwise have that opportunity.
The movie The Social Dilemma asserts that Facebook, Google, and other tech companies have done far too little to address the addictive impact of social media on its users. But an important part of the business model is to encourage that addiction. So what do we do about that?
Well, I think the nature of addiction, I think it's very important to keep straight. And I would say that in certain instances, to be clear, there is an addictive effect that comes from social media that the social media companies are responsible for. I don't think, however, it's ultimately equivalent to physical or psychological addictions that would be recognized in the DSM or by a trained psychologist. I think, though, that to the extent that there are addictive qualities in social media, the companies themselves have started to recognize this. What's a good example of this? Well, just recently I saw, and I just read what I see on the internet now along with everybody else. I have no inside information anymore. Instagram and some other social media companies began experimenting with taking away that like button, Arthur, that I was mentioning earlier, and just allowing people to post or not post without any indication of how many people have seen the post or enjoyed it or whatnot. So I think they're starting to understand that public display of appreciation, or that upvote button or that like button, can contribute to a lot of the negative effects of the media in ways that are harmful. And ultimately, if users are harmed in ways that drive them from the platforms, these companies suffer. So there's a bit of a self-interest here that I think we can leverage as well.
Well, following up on that, there's strong evidence that social media causes or contributes to more loneliness, self-hatred, and suicides, especially among teens and other young, more vulnerable people. I assume you don't challenge the statistics, and what should be done about that, and by whom?
I don't challenge any of the statistics that I've seen. I would point out that those same concerns, and they're legitimate concerns. We all care about our kids. I don't think there's any dispute about that. Were raised in the 1980s about video games and about television in the 1950s. I think the most important questions we need to address are, why are we feeling so isolated from one another, regardless of technology? I think in this COVID era, we've all experienced that sense of isolation to an even greater degree, and we've seen the effects of that, unfortunately, as a result. But I think that to the extent that social media is a part of the problem, and as you heard in my remarks, I believe they are part of the problem. I think it's fair to ask, what are things we can do to break this cycle, that meet people where they are? It is simply not realistic to tell a 16-year-old to stop using Instagram or Snapchat. It's not going to happen. So we can debate all we want about how much they're responsible for this and why they shouldn't ever have existed. Or I think we can focus on dealing with the reality that kids and all of us on this screen and around the world want this technology in our lives. So how do we make it most effective and safest while we're accepting that it's not part of how we live?
We need to turn the
interesting,
meeting over to Fernando, who will end the formal meeting, and then we'll be back for 15 more minutes of Q&A.
Oh, excellent, excellent. I wondered if we'd have time for that. Judge Grewal, thank you. What an interesting presentation. You went from social media to Bitcoin effortlessly, seamlessly. Thank you. You know, we've made a contribution, our club has, on your behalf and on behalf of all program speakers, to a local nonprofit, Our City Forest. And we've contracted with them to plant 46, now 72 shade trees in East San Jose to combat heat islands, address climate change, provide wildlife habitat, and improve our neighborhoods. That is in lieu of paying you. So thank you very much for coming to talk to us. Well, let's see. Rotarians, next week is my last meeting, and my debunking will be one for the book. So judging from past debunkings, you won't want to miss that. I'll be there. So to paraphrase my favorite immigrant governor, hasta la vista, Rotarians, and back to Judge Grewal. Thank you.
Paul, is it true that based on Google and Facebook surveillance and algorithms, that two people will get different answers to the identical question addressed to Google? Is there any such thing as truth on Google?
I can't speak to the specifics, Arthur, of how Google's algorithm works. I do know that personalization is an essential part of how these technologies ultimately deliver results. And while I think there is a very fair and reasonable question to ask about whether or not people are seeing two versions of the same fact, whether they are adopting their own truth in response to queries to Google or any other search engine, I think the solution ultimately is for more transparency about how these things work so that people can make informed choices based on their level of comfort with that operation.
I see a question in the chat, which is interesting. Is it the natural passions of citizens that threaten our democracy, or is it instead those from the billionaire class who fund the social media propaganda and also fund the candidates that led to a lack of civility in the halls of Congress?
You know, I started, Arthur, with the Federalist Papers and James Madison. I wish more of us had a chance or took the chance to go back and read them, because if you look at the state of affairs in the 1770s and 1760s in this country, you see all of these same dynamics in play hundreds of years before there were social media sites and oligarchs or billionaires or whatever other label you want to apply. So I think it's fair to say that these problems remain to this day and that we need to address them in our present society. But the notion that this is unique or a recent phenomenon, I think, is simply misguided. I do think that, again, transparency can take us a long way here. If we can understand who is contributing to what political campaign, if we can better understand whose money is behind what social media campaign, I think we have a better chance to understand what the ultimate solution to the problems are that we're talking about here today.
If Facebook deems that a statement from a politician has broken its rules, but is nevertheless, quote, newsworthy and enough and in the public interest, it can still decide to leave the post up. The company says it plans to disclose such instances when they occur, but that seems to leave enormous discretion with Facebook, and it could be used for political purposes. And of course, that policy could apply to foreign leaders as well. Could you comment on that?
I think Facebook has recognized that its newsworthiness exception has created a lot of confusion and has a great potential for inconsistency. And that's why you've seen, I think, changes announced that will limit its application, even where the speaker or the person posting the information is a politician. I think what's very, very important to recognize is that whether you have a newsworthy exception or not, these companies, by necessity, are going to play a significant part in the speech that we all enjoy one way or the other. Rules cannot be designed in advance that eliminate the possibility of inconsistency or even bias in certain instances. So I think the best thing for us to do is to accept that at the scale with which these companies operate, billions of users globally, tens of billions, maybe even trillions now of pieces of content, we are going to have to rely upon them as arbiters. And it is therefore incumbent upon all of us to impose restrictions on how they operate and standards by which they will be measured so we can understand what decisions they're making, even if we accept a certain error rate that's inevitable.
Does social media elevate the voices of the voiceless by making access to the public square more accessible?
I think it started out that way. I remember back in 2009 or 2010, when the Arab Spring was taking place, you saw people on Facebook in Tahrir Square in Egypt connecting with other elements of society for the very first time, and ultimately deposing a longstanding dictatorship with speed that no one could have even imagined 6 months before. We're a long way from 2010 today. Now, that said, I think there is still an important role that social media plays in giving the voiceless access. The fact of the matter is, if you're a little kid in a small town and you're of a certain gender identity, or you come from a certain ethnic community, a generation ago, you had no access to people who could identify with your sense of self. And today you now have access to people like you all over the world. That's a powerful use case that's replicated all the day in and day out all over the world that we need to continue to appreciate as we craft these rules so that we don't kill the good while addressing the bad.
With respect to high-tech companies which seem to dominate their industries, such as Apple and Amazon, what do you anticipate the current administration will do in the antitrust arena? I know you touched upon what you thought they should do. Could you include in your opinions, the recent appointment of 32-year-old Lina Khan, a critic of the tech industry, as the new chairperson of the FTC? By the way, I'm just telling you, I worked for 4 years at the FTC in the antitrust area, so I have some antitrust background too. And my views on the subject have changed since the economies and importance of other countries have grown dramatically. So I'm somewhat less concerned about American company dominating the world market than I would have been years ago when there was the monopolistic concern. But I'm interested in your views.
Well, I can't speak to the or claim to have any particular insight as to how the administration is going to approach any of its open investigations or litigations against the big tech companies. I do think that the Biden administration has very much signaled that it is committed to seeing these investigations through by its appointments. Certainly, Chairwoman Khan is an exceptional talent and a leading thinker on so many of these issues that we're talking about, whether it's dominance online, whether it's anti-competitive conduct on the part of the tech companies. She is an expert in her field, even at the ripe old age of 32. I do think, though, that even as we're going to see a much more aggressive posture by our government and governments all over the world towards the technology industry, a little humility goes a long way. The fact of the matter is, one of the lessons I learned, Arthur, when we served as colleagues together, is that even as the judge, even as the arbiter with access to all the information you want from all sides, your view of the dispute, your view of the case is necessarily constrained and limited. You are looking only at portions of a record. You never have perfect insight or visibility across the entire record of a dispute. And I just think that acting appropriately or in accordance with that limited perspective can impose a certain discipline, even as, real conduct, real anti-competitive conduct needs to be addressed with real remedies. I accept that.
Should our U.S. social media companies deal with the increasing pressure and surveillance by other governments, notably the Chinese government? For example, Yahoo succumbed and gave the Chinese government a private email, and the government promptly put the author of that email in jail.
Yeah, I think that state as well as affiliated non-state intelligence interest in tech has never been greater, and I think we're only going to see that continue to grow over time. The fact of the matter is that these companies have massive budgets and large staffs of people, thousands of people in some instances, dedicated and focused on the problem of state surveillance each and every day. But what I think is important to understand, Arthur, is that so many of the most significant threats aren't really through the back door, are they? They're through the front door. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Internet Research Agency operating on behalf of the Russian government didn't break into any server or hack any system. They went online and created an account like anybody else and used the tools as they were designed to achieve their aims. That's a very different, and I would argue, much more pernicious and challenging problem that we ought to stay focused on even as we continue to harden these systems.
Nicole Perlroth wrote what I believe is the most important book I've read in the last 5 years. This is How They Tell Me the World Ends. It's about cyber attacks and cyber security. Can Coinbase and the social media companies protect themselves from cyber attacks? Are they really prepared to do that? And how?
Well, I think companies across all industries need to take these risks seriously, right? So social media companies and financial firms are one thing, but we've seen, natural gas and gasoline pipelines shuttered by these types of attacks. We've seen meat packing plants and water facilities overwhelmed by these types of attacks. And so I think one encouraging sign I'm seeing is that industries of all types are now taking these responsibilities seriously. They don't have a choice. We don't have a choice. There are bad people looking to do bad things, and in ways that will affect not just the companies, but our citizenry. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to act accordingly, invest the appropriate resources to keep people safe.
How can the government or the industry stop Russia, Iran, and other bad actors from using social media to disrupt and interfere with our elections?
Well, that's a big question for a rapid fire Q&A. I'll just offer one or two quick thoughts. I think the most important thing our government can do to counteract these threats is to continue to invest significant resources in classic intelligence operations. The fact of the matter is understanding who these organizations are, how they operate, what their tactics are remains critical to our keeping our country safe, and then sharing that intelligence appropriately with the companies that are or individuals who are most likely to be victims of this type of behavior. I don't think we can privatize this security, if you will, entirely, even though the private sector has an important part to play.
Cryptocurrencies have the potential to upend monetary and fiscal policy as we know it, with peer-to-peer participation. What steps, if any, should the federal government take to regulate it?
I think the federal government has already taken significant steps to treat cryptocurrencies in a manner consistent with more traditional assets. For example, firms like ours are required to identify and validate the identity of each and every one of our customers before they operate on our platform. We are required to comply with sanctions screening requirements to prevent users from interacting with individuals in sanctioned countries such as Iran or Venezuela or North Korea. And there are restrictions on the types of assets that firms can offer. For example, under the United States law, securities, assets which are deemed to be federal securities, can only be offered on registered exchanges or alternative registered markets. So there's already a significant scheme in place that governs and regulates these companies. I think the most important thing that the government can do on top of all of that is to invest in understanding how crypto assets work. I've made an open offer to anyone in Washington or anywhere else that wants to learn about how these assets work to call me into their office or jump on a Zoom call, and I'll spend the time to explain it to you.
We had a previous speaker talk to us about cryptocurrency, and I would say probably 5% of the audience understood fully what he said.
Well, Arthur, you didn't invite me to that talk. Maybe
I know. But you weren't even working there then. You were in another world. Okay. Brian Armstrong, the CEO of Coinbase, told his employees that he won't stand for politics and the championing of social issues at work. That's very interesting, whether companies are going to now stop their employees from talking at the water fountain, so to speak, about politics, which has historically always been a major topic among friends and enemies. How has that been received by employees, and how effective has what he said really been?
Well, to be super crisp about it, what our CEO has said is that putting to the side protected political activity regarding workplace conditions and so forth, Coinbase will be a company where you can do your best work regardless of your politics. And what that means in practice is that we are not a place where people should expect that they will be able to engage in unprotected political activity during the workday and in the workplace. Because what we have found, Arthur, as it has played out over the several months that have followed, is that the vast majority of our employees, and the many that we have hired since we announced this policy, have embraced this idea that work can once again be a place where politics don't matter. And even if you or I or others disagree about a particular candidate or a particular issue, we can find common cause in advancing the state of the crypto economy, which happens to be our business and our company's mission. That's liberating to a lot of people, including young people who are otherwise very politically engaged. It may not be for everybody, but that's okay too. That's why we put out our policy very publicly, and we hope that that appeals to people. But if it doesn't, they should choose to take their work and their labor elsewhere where they'll feel more comfortable. That's, I think, the most reasonable position we can take.
If you're comfortable answering these questions, I'd appreciate it, but not if you don't want to. Are most buyers of transactions on Coinbase institutional buyers or individuals? And what's the typical size of a transaction on Coinbase? And the third question, which relates, is how long does the typical Coinbase buyer hold on to the cryptocurrency?
Well, I can't speak numbers, but what I can say is that Coinbase has both an institutional business as well as a retail business. So we have tens of millions of verified users and many millions of people each month who buy and sell crypto in their personal capacity. People like you or me who have a Coinbase account on their phone, who are buying and selling Ethereum, Bitcoin, and other coins. Our institutional business doesn't attract quite the same attention in the public consciousness, but it actually is a very important part of our future. And we have now seen that companies have become much more crypto forward in their thinking. CFOs, treasurers who a year ago would have never have dreamed of putting any portion of their crypto balance, or their balance sheet rather, in their treasury into crypto, are now looking for ways to be able to do that. And that has been transformative for our business, and we think will be a large part of the opportunity going forward. As for how long people buy it, hold it, and sell it, I can't speak to specific numbers. What I can say is that, speaking very personally now, the promise of crypto is that it is a store of value akin to gold. And, my view on gold is that it's something you buy and hold for a lifetime, or hopefully many lifetimes over multiple generations. It's not something you hustle in and out of looking to take advantage of a price swing. But that's just my view. Others have different approaches, and we'll see who turns out to be right.
Well, you were a fabulous speaker. I knew you would be, but you were absolutely a fabulous speaker. And I want to thank you for your time and work and talking to us. We really appreciate it. And and I wish you personally all the best. And of course, when you were talking about you can't control children, I know you have children, and I'm sure there's some personal experience there. I have the same situation. Anyway, you were wonderful, Paul, and thank you very, very much. I'll turn this back over to Fernando.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you, President Fernando, and thank you all for this opportunity.
Oh, thank you very much. I still don't know where to find the price quotes for this cryptocurrency that that seems to be gathering so much attention. Thank you all for staying with them. We appreciate your attention and your support, and we look for you next week, my last week before turning it over to Steve Borkenhagen. Thanks, Judge Grewal.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. That was fantastic. Good to see
Bye,
you again.
everybody.
Bye.